So the next thing that we have is our panel on multi-stakeholder collaboration. Canada has some significant examples of multi-stakeholder agreements: the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement, the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement, and the White Horse Mining Initiative, just to name a few. Have you ever wondered what it takes to be an effective participant in the development of one of these agreements? Well, we have gathered a panel of well-known advocates from the front lines of Canada's environmental arena to add a deeper understanding and more texture to the complex world of multi-stakeholder collaboration and engagement. Dan Johnson will be moderating the panel for you today. I think it would be fair to say that there are few people in Canada who have a deeper understanding of what it takes to shepherd people with divergent worldviews successfully through interest-based negotiation. So without further ado, I am handing it over to Dan and leaving you in his capable hands.
Up we go. Okay, so hopefully this is going to be both informative and a lot of fun. Have a chance today to meet and talk to a number of folks here that I've dealt with over the last 20 years, as they've all been engaged as negotiators or advocates in a number of pretty significant and at times relatively complex challenges. So I'm going to start by introducing them, and then after that I'm going to speak a little bit about how we're going to handle the program. So we'll do this simply. To make it easier for me, I arranged them in alphabetical order. So we're going to start with Sephora Berman, who's on my immediate right. I should probably say Dr. Sephora Berman. She received an honorary doctorate from UBC 2 years ago? Last year. She's an author. She's written a book published by Random House called These Crazy Times, Living Our Environmental Challenge. Sephora has been at the front line of environmental activism for the last 20 years, one of the world's most recognized environmental strategists. You've had, what, 2 stints with Greenpeace? And
10 years apart.
10 years apart. The last one actually involved a fairly significant campaign to make sure that she didn't go back to Greenpeace, but that was another story. We'll get into that later. And she was the co-founder of Forest Ethics and sort of a lead negotiator in a number of conflicts that certainly people here in Canada would recognize, ranging from Clayoquot Sound, where she met some other panel members, we'll get to that in a minute, through the Great Bear Rainforest, the Canadian Boreal Forest Initiative, and she's more recently working on climate issues. Next to Sephora is Steve Carr. Steve's currently the Deputy Minister of Liquefied Natural Gas, or LNG, in British Columbia. But before moving into that portfolio, Steve has had a long and distinguished career in the BC government, and from his earliest days has always been an advocate for and fan of collaborative stakeholder processes, and we'll find out a little bit about why that is later on. And once again, I think even you were involved in the Great Bear Rainforest at one point. Was, yeah. But what you'll get from Steve is somebody that, from a government perspective, has been through this, both at the operational level, when he worked leading a number of government negotiating teams and collaborative exercises, up to the decision-making level in the more recent years, where he's had a responsibility to shepherd these sorts of recommendations from stakeholders through government. Next to Steve, we have Linda Cody, and Linda has also had an interesting career. She and Sephora first met on either side of a protest in Clayoquot Sound. That was because at that point, Linda was with Macmillan Bloedel. She ended her career at Macmillan Bloedel as Vice President of Environment. She then became Vice President of Environment for Weyerhaeuser. She then became Vice President, Western Region for the World Wildlife Federation, or Fund. She then became Vice President of Sustainability for VANOC for the 2010 Games in Vancouver. And after a brief stint teaching at university, she is now the Chief Sustainability Officer for Enbridge. Next to Linda, we have Mark Hubert. Mark has been in the forest sector for over 20 years, both from the private sector as well as a civil servant earlier on in his career. He is now the Vice President of Environmental Leadership for the Forest Products Association of Canada. Mark is one of the lead negotiators in the recent Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement entered into between a number of forest products companies and environmental organizations across the country. Was the first co-executive director of a joint secretariat that was established to oversee the implementation of that agreement. And in addition to, sometimes I wonder whether he spends as much time dealing across the table with people like Janet, who you'll meet shortly, as he's actually had to deal working with his own caucus members and helping to corral them. And I suspect that that's probably been the more challenging job at times. And finally, on my far right, we have Janet Sumner. Janet is currently the executive director of CPAW's Wildlands League. Before that, I believe you were the director of communications for Pembina.
Yep.
Early on in Janet's career, she dealt with a number of issues around pollution in the Great Lakes, acid rain, these sorts of issues. But in the last 10 years, I think you've focused pretty much full-time on mining and forestry issues. Yep. And also, most recently, very actively involved in the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement, and certainly a driving force representing the Environmental Caucus at this point in time. So this is your panel today. We're going to spend a little bit of time initially. They're going to share with you just a few observations, their personal observations about multi-stakeholder processes, why they think they work, what they think makes them work. I don't have the faintest idea what they're going to say. But they're going to be cautious because the next part of the program is going to be I get to ask them questions, and they don't have the faintest idea what those questions are going to be yet. So, but not only am I going to ask them questions, but after I ask the question and we hear the answer, I'm going to invite the other panelists to jump in on the same issue. And finally, we're going to throw it open and provide you with an opportunity to ask your questions. And what I would encourage you at that point in time is treat this as an opportunity to, if we go back to some of the earlier presentations, and we heard about some of the reasons why it's important to be courageous or to speak your mind. It's a great opportunity to ask questions. They can't leave. They can't say no. And I know that you happen to have a wealth of experience up here. And so let's get started. And this part, we are going to go across the couch, and then I'm going to start becoming a little bit more random when I get into asking questions in terms of the order we're going to go. So, Sephora. Any thoughts?
A couple. Thanks, Dan. So as Dan mentioned, I've been working on environmental campaigns and also on solutions collaboratives for about 20 years now. The Clayoquot Sound, the Great Bear Rainforest, the Boreal, and more recently, which you wouldn't know as much about, Dan, because I was working out of Europe for a couple of years with the IT sector, where I ran a global campaign against Facebook on Facebook. Which resulted in a collaborative process with Facebook. They became actually the first IT company in the world to include renewable energy in their procurement policies for their data centers. But today I thought that it would be interesting actually to start at the beginning of that journey, because I've been reflecting a lot since I moved back to Canada how to apply the lessons that I've learned over the last 20 years to energy debates in the country. I'm working now primarily on oil sands and pipeline issues. And I started working on these issues 20 years ago, fresh out of university. And at the time, I was pretty clear that the issues were black and white. There were good guys and there were bad guys. I was working on trying to stop old growth logging in our rainforests, and I was pretty clear what side of the fence I was on. And the more I explored the issues, the more complex I found them, of course, realized what shades of gray there were. But most importantly, I think for this discussion, started actually figuring out how to see people and not just positions. And realized over the process of a number of years that, in fact, if I really wanted to build solutions, that the people I needed to build those solutions were actually the people from industry and government who knew the most about the issues. And that was actually considered fairly heretical in my community. There was the first meetings I had with Linda, in fact, 20 years ago almost now, we had to do in secret because I actually, for a while, couldn't even let people from Greenpeace know that I was meeting with Macmillan Bodell, because then I was a traitor. And so there was this so there are huge cultural barriers to our actually having conversations, especially when there are conflicts. And trying to build trust in a conflict situation is difficult. And so for me, one of the most important lessons I learned was about how important personal relationships are in building that trust. And in fact, it partly started as an accident. Because my closest friend who I was working with, Karen Mahan, was on maternity leave. She just had a baby, and she was living in Kitsilano, and one day we were walking down a street with her baby in this new navy blue stroller with white polka dots. I'll never forget it, because then Linda came along rolling her navy blue white stroller with white polka dots with the baby the exact same age. And we kind of stopped on the sidewalk, and I looked at Karen, and she looked at me, and we didn't know whether to say hello, and there was this whole, weird moment. And Linda turned graciously to her husband and said, I'd like to introduce you to my arch enemies. And we all had a good laugh. And we said, we were all off work. It was a Sunday. And do you want to go for coffee? Okay, let's go for coffee. We went for coffee. And we talked about babies and strollers. And then we started actually talking. And that conversation led to what later became the Macmillan-Bloedel Forest Project, where Macmillan-Bloedel became one of the first companies in the world to work with environmental groups collaboratively to try and redefine logging in old-growth forests. And it was really, for me, the first time that I was actually having a real conversation. And I'll wrap up, Dan. I know I'm almost at 5 minutes, but I wanted to wrap up with this last story because it was a seminal moment for me. We realized that we couldn't actually have this conversation in Canada at the time. We couldn't even find a place to meet. These were front page issues, the war in the woods, it was. So we organized a little couple of day retreat outside of the country in California, and we had a mediator there. And the first night, he said to me and Bill Cafferata, who was the chief forester of Macmillan-Bloedel, he said, okay, so I want you two to go off in this room, and I want you pretend to be Bill, and you have to meet your bottom line and meet all your outrageous demands. I was representing Greenpeace International at the time. And Bill, I want you to be Sephora, and you have to figure out how do you protect the old growth values and biodiversity and everything she's talking about, and how much logging can you support then, if that's your goal, is protecting those values. And so Bill Cafferata and I went off in this room together. And to be clear, I was terrified of Bill Cafferata, right? Like, Bill Cafferata is 7 feet tall, and he's, he'd been in this industry he's an ex-Marine. He's been in the industry at the time. He'd been chief forester for 30 years. I was 24, and this was my first job. And I was, terrified. And so we sit down across the table from each other, and he looks at me and he goes, look at this big sigh, and rubs his face, and he says, I'm getting a cold beer. Do you want one? And I was like, okay. Bill went off and got a cold beer. And about 2 hours later, there we were with our beers, laughing our heads off. And it was an incredible breakthrough for me to see Bill as a person. And he actually said to me that night, he said, do you think I wake up in the morning and say, how much forest can I destroy? I became a forester because I love forests. And I said to him, okay, well, I have family that work for Macmillan-Bloedel. Do you think I get up in the morning and say, how many jobs can I destroy today? And we had this open conversation, and through that conversation, we started understanding each other's barriers and building trust. And that was, for me, the beginning of what became this kind of 20-year journey.
Steve.
Thanks, Dan. So I've worked for government for about 30 years in a variety of different areas. My early days were in forestry, and actually some of the better days. We worked on some collaborative processes when I was living in the Okanagan Shuswap. And I think I've really kind of seen an evolution of collaboration from the kind of mid-1990s up until now. Some of it is kind of just the way my job's been positioned. I always found I had a lot fewer bosses when I was in a regional field office than I do now in Victoria. Makes life a little bit more complicated. But on the good side, deputies don't really have to do much work anyways, so you just kind of sit back and watch things unfold. But the early collaboration that I was involved in the Okanagan Shuswap had some really interesting moments, and I'm going to share a few of those. But I've seen the evolution kind of go from, this was a multi-stakeholder process. A number of people in this room were involved in it, up to 20 stakeholders, a full consensus process that had to reach full consensus or no deal at the end of the day. So I would say it's in a purest form, it was a very, very collaborative process. What I've seen now in my job, particularly in the last 5 years, is very much of a segmented collaboration, more on the bilateral side, a lot of bilateral negotiations kind of building on each other to get to solutions, probably both at the strategic level and the project level. And I think both of them have their pros and cons. When I look back at the the positives of the Okanagan-Shuswap LRMP process, which really was a land use process where the fundamental issue was how much protected area to set aside in an area that was very low in protected areas. Not sure if many people know the Okanagan, but it's actually got the only desert in Canada. Sonora Desert comes up into the Okanagan. Probably has the highest percentage of species at risk in Canada because of the nature of the ecosystems there. So there's a lot of issues that needed to be resolved, and there's a lot of desire to get more representation into protected areas in this area. At the same time, you had strong ranching communities that wanted to graze these grasslands. You had harvest companies, logging companies that wanted to continue harvesting, mining companies that wanted to continue to mine. So what I did see through this process, and it took 5 years from start to finish, was a durable end, and it is durable to this day. And I think that if you look at what happened in that process, there was strong relationships that were built at the stakeholder level. And even after the decisions were made and we reached a consensus, which was quite an entertaining day for me. I remember it was a complete lockdown. We had been literally at this thing for 5 years. And we had developed a good body of science. We had a lot of relationships that had been established, but we still had some fundamental differences. And it all came down to one evening where we decided we were going to start the negotiation in the morning, and we were not going to basically leave until we reached a consensus. And I always remember at about 2 or 3 in the morning looking over at Dan, who was the facilitator, and every time he came into the room after a bilateral discussion, like he had wet hair and he was looking really clean and really, quite sharp. He says to me, the key to these negotiations, he says, you got to look like you're fresher than the people you're meeting with. So I take a shower every hour. But at the end of the day, we reached consensus on the protected areas and management zones and everything in this process. And it's been durable up to now. And the relationships that were formed actually help to deal with the inevitable issues you have afterwards in terms of different interpretations of implementation of things and everything else. It empowers people as well. A story I have at the end of this process, I was kind of a junior forester in a forest district office, and I was pretty naive to politics. And in the Okanagan at the time, there was an NDP government in power, but it was a Liberal government right across the Okanagan. Every MLA was Liberal. And we got down to the end of the process. Decisions were made, consensus was reached. And one of the political MLAs decided that he was going to basically uproot this process and didn't like it. It was somebody that actually, there was a shift in power in 2001 and the Liberals came in, and he was making very hard attempts to undermine the process. And it was actually industry that came up and other stakeholders that convinced him that this is something that we agreed upon, we want to live by it, and this is something that we feel is durable. So you have that kind of buy-in at the stakeholder level, and you have the kind of the goodwill of the people. We also had a lot of body of information that was gathered over a long period of time that has really helped to implement the project over the last number of years. When I look at the cons in the process, and then the biggest one is the time it takes, and that's probably why the full consensus collaboration process hasn't been used in a big way. You tend to outlive your decisions in these processes. It takes so long to get to a final consensus that often some of the economic imperatives aren't met. You can also pin government into a place they don't want to be over a period of time. Not purposefully, but as things develop, governments become more uncomfortable with the way some of the outcomes that come out of these longer processes. So I think it's very important that that these discussions that we have in building collaboration have to have a timeline to them. that are realistic. And I think that that's why segmented or staged kind of collaboration is now kind of the way we approach most of our issues. And the ones that I've been involved in recently, the bilateral negotiations, there's a lot more flexibility. As government, you have to realize that you need to know your constituents in any of these negotiations, and we'll probably have a bit more discussion about that. But in government, it's very complex, and you need to understand how to kind of maneuver through those to make sure the outcomes aren't something that at the end of the day government can't live with. And the bilaterals tend to be a lot more flexible and allow for that to occur. So I think that over the evolution of collaboration from full consensus to where we are, the keys are the people, making sure you understand the issues, making sure you build the relationships as quickly as possible, make sure you use good sound information, and a number of other principles that we'll probably talk about a little bit more as we kind of move through. So I'll just probably leave it there.
So you want to pick up with the baby stroller?
Well, I was going to tell that story, but no, we talked about it beforehand. No, I have a different story for you. So as you heard, I have worked on multi-party collaborations for most of my career, and I'm a little bit older than Sephora, so I could probably say I've worked on them for 30 years anyhow, in the BC coastal forest industry, which you've heard both Sephora and Steve talk about from a forest industry perspective. So land use, Aboriginal issues, forest planning, forest practices. Then when I was with WWF Canada, my focus really was on marine planning and conservation off the coast of BC. And working at the Olympics, it was really a different slice on it. It was the sustainability program for the Games. But the environmental side of it was pretty straightforward. It wasn't too complex on the environmental side. We did green venues and public transit, and it wasn't the hard part. The hard part really was on the social issue side of managing the impact of a mega event on different types of communities, and particularly on communities that face challenges socioeconomically, and the displacement on the housing issues, and the access to goods and services during the Games, and inclusion in the benefits from a mega event that has really a reputation for being quite an elite-based thing, like Olympics do. So in all of these incarnations, I've worked on multi-party collaborations. I've become a true believer in what they can do on shared sustainability goals. As you've heard, there's lots, and from your own experiences, there's lots of pluses and minuses and lots of challenges and constraints. But in my experience, what a multi-party collaboration can achieve that a unilateral or bilateral one often can't, or frequently can't, comes down to two things. The first one is pretty obvious. It's the 1 + 1 = 3. So you can, in a multi-party collaboration, if you can get agreement, if you can get that shared goal and agreement on how you're going to pursue it, you can mobilize more resources, right? You can bring to bear more resources and talent than you can on a unilateral or a bilateral basis. So that's one of the value propositions for multi-party collaborations. And then if you want to go, the second outcome that I've seen and been part of sometimes, not as frequently as the 1 + 1 = 3, but is where you really actually come up with an idea that's transformative. And again, that's truly transformative. That is a leap beyond the current situation, which none of the parties involved in the multi-party collaboration could actually ever see when they first started that. And the opportunity for that transformative idea or opportunity emerges from the engagement. And so that's more sort of the proverbial, what I would say, the third way, right? So it's beyond 1 + 1 = 3. It's a different pathway. And you can only see that pathway by going through the multi-party collaboration and all the ups and downs and challenges and hits and misses that are usually part of that. So, but as we all know, there's a lot of risk associated with heading off the beaten path and going down a pathway that you can't even see when you start out on the journey where it's going to go. And so the story I wanted to share with you, the initial one for today, was when I was working in the coastal forest industry, and I was working with a couple other companies, and in a multi-party collaboration or negotiation, you have to have delegated authority or responsibility, right? So we were meeting with our CEOs and we were trying to get a delegated mandate to sit down with Sapura and others and start looking at issues. It was around the Great Bear Rainforest. And there was a lot of skepticism, obviously, from the CEOs about whether or not this would be a good idea and how much would it cost. And, we're already, got these campaigns. We've already got all this negative, public relations stuff going on. Could this make it worse? And anyhow, on and on. How will the local communities feel and how will the First Nations feel? And so we were making the argument to the CEOs about what the value proposition was of pursuing this. And so I had been to, I'm sure, one too many conferences in California by that point. And I had this really elaborate theory of, cooperation, simultaneous cooperation and collaboration going on, or competition going on in ecosystems. And that's how ecosystems evolve and innovate and become resilient. And so what we had to follow was this ecosystem model, right? So I had the PowerPoints and here's the real rationale, or the really good reason why we have to do it, because we need this resilience, we need this innovation, and we can only get it by cooperating and competing at the same time and adopting this ecosystem model. So anyhow, there were like blank looks on everybody's faces. Even the foresters were horrified by what I had come up with as the compelling value proposition. And so then I began, this was an aha moment in my life, and I swear, I'm an arts graduate, but I did come up with it. Then I began to kind of think, I thought, okay, so cooperation, simultaneous cooperation. What else has simultaneous cooperation and competition leading to innovation, resilience, and adaptation besides an ecosystem? A market. Where's David from when we knew? A market. So quickly reinvent the value proposition. This is a market-based approach to solving some of these issues. We're going to harness market forces. We're going to make this transform. Anyhow, so the market-based argument won the day, or well, really there were other things too. But anyhow, it was just an interesting way to kind of look at it from both an economic as well as an environmental perspective. And I think in getting that delegated responsibility from the companies that we were working in, we really had to be able to take that value proposition across all kinds of values. So that's my opening story.
Mark.
Thanks, Dan. As Dan mentioned, I started my career in the private sector working for a few small forest companies in BC, and then moved to the provincial government in Victoria. Worked there for about 8 years. And that was at the time that the Great Bear stuff was going on, and the things that later on in the process that Linda and Sapura both talked about, and then moved on back to the private sector and have been in the private sector representing the forest sector for about 20 forest companies for the last 10, 12 years. And so I've had the opportunity to witness or be involved in those multi-stakeholder collaborations from both the government perspective and the industry perspective. And I guess one of the takeaways, I'll give you a few thoughts, but how we engage in collaborative processes, how we engage determines the ease or difficulty with which we will move through life. And those multi-stakeholder or collaborative processes are really microcosms of life to some extent, to the extent that we have you talk about marriage or you talk about personal relationships. They are also microcosm or microcosmic collaborative engagements, and the degree to which you engage in them this way or that way will influence the ease or difficulty with which you move through. Collaboration, the word collaboration, we tend to internalize as easy, often because it is framed as the opposite of conflict or the opposite of confrontation. But in fact, collaboration is not synonymous with easy. And I mean, the same way as we talk about having to work in a marriage or work in a relationship, collaboration is actually hard. And I mean, some of us have better relationships or marriages than others, and it's that's natural, and how we engage in certain activities dictates that. We have templates, I mean, if it were easy, we would just have templates that we would each check boxes in and fill out and mail back to each other, and that would be that. But that's actually not what happens. That's not reality. We have non-disclosure agreements, we have MOUs, we have confidentiality agreements that dictate how we protect our interests. And that's more of a reality. And that said, there are certain things that we can do to make it easier. And so I've listed a couple things here. I know we only have 5 minutes, and so I'll see if I can give you 10 quick things that we can maybe come back to in the conversation in 5 minutes, knowing that I've already used up 3 of them.
3.5.
All right. So the first is keeping the end state in mind, the state that you're trying to achieve. So you presumably, or whoever enters into a collaborative process, enters into it with the presumption or presuming that you can achieve some sort of measure of success. And so keeping our eyes on the prize when things get difficult is the first thing, and everything flows from there. Second thing is, and this is similar to something that Sephora said, and Linda touched on, I guess, as well, is that organizations, because we're often entering into these things as organizations or as representatives of organizations, whether they be an NGO group, a government, or a First Nation, or an industry participant, they are actually, organizations are collections of humans. And so they're not monolithic things. We typically see them as representing forest ethics, or Macmillan Bloedel, or the forest sector, or oil and gas, but even the entities are collections of human beings. So that's number one. We can delve into some of these things later.
That was number 2.
Sorry, number 2, that flows from number 1. Third, assumptions are dangerous. We all act on what we often probably mistakenly call facts. So a set of facts or set of circumstances, which are oftentimes really assumptions. And so making decisions based on our view of the world, our assumptions, is dangerous. We just have to watch it. Fourth, be exploratory. It commits you to nothing. And is often the most educational process or an educational aspect of a multi-stakeholder or a collaborative engagement. Be dispassionately analytical. No wishful thinking. The very fact that you sometimes run into roadblocks in collaborative process is because we'll enter into a discussion or have a debate based on our view of what is logical. What should we logically do? The very fact that we are having the debate means that there are 2 versions of logical. There are 2 views of what logical is. So be dispassionately analytical and understand that there is a different view than yours, and there's a different sense of what the logical next step might be. Next, back pocket plans are, we all want to have a contingency plan or a backup plan. Just in case X doesn't work. And we're advised often to make sure that we do that. And it's wise. We're all risk managers to some degree, even as we're going through collaborative engagements. But we have to be careful because those things can creep into the psyche of collaborative process. Have the wisdom and courage to change course or to change your mind. That's one of the toughest things. I mean, we all get embedded in certain paths or certain conversations during or along the journey, and having the wisdom and then more importantly the courage to change course or to change your mind, knowing that you're going to be seen as weak or floundering or flip-flopping is something that takes, like I say, takes courage. 3 more, worry about yourself. You can't control what anybody else does, or you have less control of what other people do in a process. You can control what you do. And so, I mean, again, it's true in life and it's true in these processes because, as I say, in my view, they are microcosms of life. Patience. There are always external forces. Steve talked about the fact that, particularly in government, things are complex. These things are always complex. And if you're doing anything big and important, it's going to be complex. There are external forces that are always coming into play, things that you don't know are going to come at you. I had a friend once tell me, and I often think about this, is life is all about timing and trade-offs. And it's somewhat simplistic, but I think very relevant in collaborative process. There are moments in time when things are going to work and moments in time when you just have to wait. And lastly, there's usually a nugget of something that you can make progress over. So the last one is stay at the table. There are always and often points in time in a conversation where we just want to say, no, they're not going to move, or we can't do that. But I would say 99% of the time, there is something that you can figure out that will break a logjam or move. So stay there and keep trying.
Janet.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks very much for inviting me. I've learned a great deal about Mark. I sit across the table from Mark in our current Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement, so this is going to be hugely helpful. Thanks. But I'll start with maybe just saying the things that I think are really important. One is around the integrity piece. And I think that people who sit at a table and have an ability to negotiate and get good outcomes are usually people who have a great deal of integrity. And that even means the integrity to say no, or I can't do it, or it's not going to work that way. And if you can look at somebody and give them that kind of information, it actually is the best place to start, because that's how you actually learn about the other side. And the other piece that you need to learn very quickly, in my experience, is how to translate and how to speak somebody else's language, how to actually become an interpreter and be able to go back and forth and go, okay, so you say things this way, and this is what it means in your world and why it means that. And I have to start adopting and using some of your language so that we can have a conversation using words that we both understand. The other kinds of things that I think are really important for me that have been life-changing have been things around getting outside my comfort zone. And I'll give you a very simple example, and I'm going to take this right outside the forestry realm and go to mining. In Ontario, I work on a small little project called the Ring of Fire. And it includes all kinds of large mining companies who want to develop the single largest mining find in Canadian history. It's a big chromite find. There's some gold there. There's some diamonds. De Beers is just to the east of that. We've got all kinds of stuff going on. And by virtue of working on some of the mining issues, I got invited to go to the Mining Hall of Fame Awards. I had never been to the Mining Hall of Fame Awards. Didn't even know that there were Mining Hall of Fame Awards. I walked into a room at one of the very large hotels downtown Toronto, and the room was about, I'd say about 90% guys. And people from all over the world flew there. And this is to say I'd also worked quite a bit in an Alberta context, and I'm a vegetarian. And so I sat down, and the filet mignon was this thick and had bacon wrapped. And most people in this part of the century now, when you sit at a meal, you usually can say, what's the vegetarian option, or is there fish, or whatever. No, we're serving filet mignon, that's it. I'm like, okay, all right, okay, I'm really outside my comfort zone now. And the guys around the table were very, very helpful. We got various things. But then they started to display what you would win, or why you would win at a Mining Hall of Fame Awards. And the pictures were one after another, basically either large holes in the ground or big mountains that have had, sort of the tops chopped off, completely denuded, and lots of tracks going around them. And everybody was clapping, and one of the mining guys reached over and goes, I guess that's not really a nice picture from your perspective. I laughed and I said, not really, no, right? But it's being okay to be comfortable in that environment so that you can learn what it is, what makes somebody successful in their world, what counts to them, what matters, why they're there, what motivates them, and showing that you can be okay with that it's not an either or. The world is not black or white or whatever. And for me, one of the ways that I approach this as we're just at the cusp of the World Cup is actually through sports. A lot of folks, especially working in resource-based industries, I'm dealing with a lot of guys all the time and having a good conversation about sports. Mark knows that I love the Habs. Dan knows that I love the Habs. And which soccer team I'm going to support, et cetera. And finding a way that you can have a common currency with somebody across the table. And that's where you start. And I'm going to just finish with one last example, another mining example. We had been dialoguing around a particular mining project in the Ring of Fire. And the way that we were dialoguing is, all of the environmental assessments that were coming up, my staff team were basically going in very deep on the research and information around these environmental assessments and uncovering all kinds of little nuggets around elevated mercury levels and, mobilization and methylization of mercury, and getting very excited about this because this is the stuff that we live and breathe, and we're quite, oh, look at this is another problem, here's another problem. And we were sending that back into the government, and the government's going, oh, well, we can't possibly say yes to this, can it? And we were going back and forth with the government on these projects and providing information as we see it as our duty because we're a public interest group. And then we got a phone call from the mining company saying, can we sit down and talk about this? You're delaying our project and you're creating a lot of problems for us. We don't understand why you've got all these issues. And because we're doing what we think is due diligence, and we're providing all the information, and we're doing all the right processes that we're being asked to do. So we said, okay, sure. What's it going to cost us to sit down, right? So we said, all right, let's go for lunch. Of course, we go to a big steakhouse. And we sit down for lunch, and we're meeting with the CEO and the COO and, vice president of this, and there's myself and Anna, who works on our project. And we're there, and one of the things I've learned very early on is to ask why. Why does somebody even care to meet with us, or why do they want to be there? And I asked the CEO of this mining company, I said, so what is it that motivates you to want to meet with me to have this conversation? Why are we at this table? And to be completely stereotypical, because that was what was in the back of my head, this guy, looked like a big Texan, the suspenders, we're at the steakhouse, the whole bit. He looks me right in the eye and he says, well, my kids went to see Avatar and I don't want to be an asshole. And I said, that's great. I can help you not be that. This is a great place to start. And so that started a 3-year conversation, and last year they were, sponsors of the CPAW's 50th gala, and we don't agree on everything. We don't sit down and say, yeah, I believe everything that you say is true, but we have a robust and rich dialogue that now has actually included other groups, and they actually come to us and say, look, the government's asking us to do it this way. We don't understand. Are you guys pushing them to do it this way? And then we include the government, and we have the conversations about, why are you asking these questions of them when really this is the issue that we're pushing for? So sometimes in that translation, it even gets lost as it goes into government, and then it comes back out again. And by virtue of having the conversation and the dialogue and being courageous enough to reach out and make that phone call, try to get that contact, I would say the other thing for me that I've learned is you have to reward courage. You have to say to somebody, look, I'm really glad that you reached out, and be willing to step outside your own comfort zone. So.
Thanks, Janet. And I think what I want to do is actually direct my first question right back at you. And because you've been involved in a lot of social conflict of different sorts through the years. And one of the things I find that people often ask me is, how do you know when it's right to collaborate? Mm-hmm. And is collaboration, is it inevitable in social conflict, or is it something, a tool to be used sparingly?
Well, I don't think it's right at every moment. And I think for me that I ultimately believe as a society, we're going to be led down the path of collaboration. Because what we've got is great economic growth, lots of ideas and innovation and all kinds of industrial activity. At the same time, we've seen the rise of, Google did the Rachel Carson birthday just the other day, right? So it's like we've seen the rise of environmentalism over the last 50 years. And as we see the rise of environmentalism, and there are more and more professional folks who are working as environmentalists, you're going to come to, push comes to shove, where you have to solve these issues. The way to solve them is nobody's going to have the right ideas in either camp. Quite frankly, I'm not going to solve a forest management plan without ever sitting down with a forest management company. That's not going to happen. In the same breath, the mining company is never going to solve their environmental problems without sitting down with me. So the path forward is going to be the middle way. Is it the right moment at this point in that conflict? That's a very separate question. And it has to, for me, the right ingredients have to be there. There has to be integrity, leadership. There has to be alignment to some degree, and the ability of both sides to bring along their respective constituency.
I would agree with that. But I think that there's an issue that people don't really want to talk about, which is power imbalance. And that has to be rectified for the conversations and the collaboration to go anywhere. I mean, sometimes when I talk about some of the collaborations we've been involved in, or when I write about it, when I've been writing about it in my book, I get the question back of, well, then why aren't you just working it out? You know, why are you organizing these campaigns? Or why were you just speaking at that protest or rally? Why don't you just sit down? And I, you know, it is a mistake to think, even if you have people with integrity who are building trust, et cetera, you can just sit down and work it out over lunch. I mean, we couldn't get the meetings with Macmillan Waddell for years that we tried to get. And even if we did get a meeting with them, they didn't have the mandate to actually solve the issues, because if the issues were easy to solve, they would be solved. They're not easy to solve, and they usually require, either they're expensive, or they require a cultural shift, or they require, you know, big shifts. And so I think part of when is the right time has to do with when have you built up enough interest, or is there enough interest and power in order for that conversation to actually move, and for people, like good people who want to do the right thing inside companies or government, to have the mandate to do it.
Yes.
Like the number of times I've actually gotten the call over the last 20 years of, you know, I really want to have that conversation you wanted to have, but can you just dial up the heat a little bit so I can get the mandate? I'm like, what am I, dial a protest? You know, it's like, but that happens. That really does happen, and it's proven to me that actually that is sometimes necessary to get the mandate, and you're going to need both those things.
I think.
Okay.
Go ahead, Steve.
I think it's interesting if you look in kind of lead up to a lot of the collaborations. You know, what Sephora is saying is it happens. Like people go, they poll with questions that kind of support their perspectives to create, you know, kind of even up the power base with the citizens so that they can get themselves in a position to enter into the conversation. The other thing is they engage in, you know, research and policy development that again supports their initiatives or their perspectives. And as government, it's like we kind of watch this, and it almost seems like it gets to a certain kind of level that they all of a sudden they say, well, we got to engage on this because, you know, we want to get either if it's a different story, we want to get that out there, or it's now time to kind of enter into the conversation because, you know, it's the right time to kind of start the debate. And so in absence of collaboration, you see a lot of that type of activity in the system.
The less polling since the BC election.
Yeah, nobody believes in polls now, do they?
So what I'm curious about, Linda, you've come at this from the perspective of representing industry, environmental groups, an enterprise like VANOC. And in all of those roles, you've had to, within the context of some of the multi-stakeholder work you do, inevitably you have to deal with governments. So what's your advice in terms of how to make sure that you are as effective as possible as an initiative when it comes to dealing with government, so that when you come and sit down with Steve, he's going to be happy to see you, as opposed to perhaps a little bit reluctant?
Well, I can hearken back to some of the mistakes we made on the forestry side in the early days, and we obviously when I was working at the Olympics, I tried not to repeat them, but not always successfully. No surprises, I guess. I think that you know, the world of multi-party collaborations is a pretty open and transparent world. That's why you see people like me who work in sustainability in a corporate environment being very involved in it, right? And so I think you have to be pretty open about what you're doing, and you certainly, if you have government agencies involved in the issues, or if you're involved in any kind of process, as we were in the coast in those days, there was a formal land use process, planning process going on. So you have to really respect the integrity of those other processes and the other stakeholders, and we sort of ran afoul of some of that in the early days on the forestry issues, and got sort of taken to school by government and First Nations about it. But then, you know, regrouped and came up with a model that was more resilient and complex and took more time.
I think one of the other ways that you can increase your chances of success in working with a government or engaging a government in what might be a bilateral process or a couple things. Engaging early with them or having conversations early with them, but also having those conversations framed in a way that indicates that the conversations you're having outside are exploratory as opposed to try and understand the issue and explore the issue as opposed to try and fix it. Because what Linda says about wanting to make sure there are no surprises for government is true, and I think you also want to make sure that they are not afraid of something that's going to come down the pipe at them that they're then going to have to deal with. And so engaging in that conversation early or letting them know that it's taking place in an exploratory manner can help them understand that it's something that can actually help them in the long run as opposed to be something that they will have to be faced or put in the position of being the meat in a sandwich and having to make a choice between two people.
Janet, Sapor, I'm going to ask Steve at the end if you've got it right. So anything else to add?
I would just add that I think that is true, Mark, at the bureaucratic level of government. Early is better. Individual conversations and relationships, even if they're not kind of a formal part of whatever table you've created, but just to be feeding information back and forth is pretty critical. And respect for existing processes, mapping out right away. Do you remember the time we finally sat down and mapped out how do our processes fit in with your processes and how do they benefit each other? And we made a diagram and and you could just kind of feel the air go out of the room. They were like, oh, okay, fine. You're not competing with us. You're actually just trying to feed good stuff into it. And that was important. But on the political level, a landing place is critical. Like we created a value proposition and a pitch for Gordon Campbell for that announcement. Like he was going to be able to get up on the stage with some big Spirit Bear statues and be a hero. And that was really important. We would never have gotten it if we didn't. And so we had to, figuring that piece out, what is the landing place? What are the benefits to those, both to the parties, but to the government, but also to the individuals, right? That was pretty important.
Yeah, to follow up on Sapora's comments, what's in it for them? And finding your leaders. So governments like corporations or environmental groups, quite frankly, are not monolithic. And there are going to be people within that structure or within that frame, whether it's at the political level, finding somebody at the cabinet table who can carry the message, a deputy minister who happens to like what you're doing or think, wow, this is really innovative, I haven't seen this before, or even finding somebody that they see as a mentor or as a role model who can actually speak to that. So finding folks that can actually start to bring that constituency along, whatever it is, whether or not they need to resolve First Nations issues or whether they need to get in good with a certain mayor or they want to make sure that a municipality is happy, finding out what actually motivates them, finding who their leaders are and who their influencers are.
Steve, would you add anything to their answers?
Well, I think that, in government, obviously, governments have mandates, and those mandates are very public. They're part of the election cycle. They are part of the commitments that they make to the people, and they get voted in around those mandates. So they hold those mandates strongly. So, to be effective in government, you have to understand those mandates. You have to get granular around them to see how your propositions may or may not line up with them, and then find ways for entry points on those. And that's how you build the trust, and that's how you build kind of progress within government. You also have to understand that government is highly siloed as well. I mean, my experience in the latest kind of project I've been involved in on the LNG side, we've kind of broke through those silos, but it's taken a lot of work in terms of deputy ministers, committees, and alignment. Most things aren't that coordinated, and so there's competing interests within the multi-stakeholder roundtables. There's competing interests within government, and different ministries have different perspectives, and different ministries have different mandates. So you have to understand that, are you talking to the right people? Are you getting kind of the messages that you need? Are you, dealing with the influencers? But ultimately, I think if you want to make progress, you do the value proposition that Sapora talked about. You line up, okay, what are your goals? What are your ambitions? how do they line up with some of the government mandates, and also realize that governments are at the political level. That's how they view these issues. Is we've got a mandate, we've got the people behind us on this mandate, and so if you want to influence that, you have to kind of understand the mandate and kind of line up your value proposition as much as possible to get the entry that you need.
I think that picking up on what Steve says, we're talking oftentimes, at least those of us here, about a natural resource environment or a public land base, and so recognizing those of us who are currently not in government, we have to keep in mind whether the outcome or the recognition is the thing that's most important for us. Recognizing that government does have a mandate and that it is a public land base. And so you hear that conversation come up a lot. And we live in a political world. Everybody has funders that they need to speak to, or constituent bases that they need to speak to as non-governmental players. And so we have to be sensitive to the fact that government does have a mandate. We are on a public land base. And like I say, understand whether or not we are more concerned with the outcome than we are with the recognition, and figure out and recognition for having made it happen, and figure out where that sweet spot is.
So I want to come back now to something that a number of you have touched on, and really ask you in a much more specific way about perhaps what the most transformational experiences you've had in these multi-stakeholder collaborations. And while I'm going to leave it up to most of you to actually answer that question unaided, I have to ask the reporter, why was Elton John so important to your career?
So at some point in the Great Bear Rainforest collaboration and discussions, because they're not always formal negotiations and often don't start that way at all. But so it was a collaborative process. I can't remember exactly at what point it was, but it was early days.
2001.
2001. So Dan suggested that we go to an Elton John concert together. So this is the First Nations leaders and the couple of some government, I think, were there, but mostly industry and environmental groups. And I say suggested because he actually said, I won't come back tomorrow unless you join me tonight at this box at an Elton John concert. And we were like, okay. And at this point, we were in daily, intense, like lock yourself in a room discussions, trying to reach an agreement. And like the pressure was really high. And so we went to this Elton John concert, and we got there, and it was a bit like some kind of horrible school dance, where they want one side of the room and the other side of the room, and they're not talking to each other, and you're just like, Dan, what have you done? Why are we here? And then like slowly the conversations started happening, and people had brought their partners. I remember that about meeting Bill Dumont's wife and how lovely she was, and that was really, Bill Dumont was chief forester of Western Forest Products at the time. And so these conversations start happening, and then the dancing starts happening, and there were just so many memorable moments I couldn't even go into it because it was just so out of the box. I just could not. There were moments where they were like, I remember Karen Mohan saying, pinch me, are we really dancing with so-and-so? And I remember one story in particular where the two people negotiating the actual lines on the map were Patrick Armstrong on behalf of industry, and Jody Holmes, who's a scientist, conservation biologist on behalf of the environmental groups. And they had been sitting down with maps trying to figure out no-go and go areas so that the industry would agree to these no-go areas, and then the environmental groups would stop the campaign. We'd all work in collaboration to try and figure out final solutions. That was the theory of change. And so Patrick, and Jody and Patrick had been going at it. Like just the meetings were horrible. And Patrick walks up to Jody and he goes, want to dance? And she just looks at him like with this, and she says, are you out of your mind? And he goes, I'll give you a valley. And she just looks at him, and she doesn't miss a beat. She's deadpan. She goes, which one? And there was just and the whole room just started laughing, and it was like the meetings had been really actually kind of horrible. Like I've never had those kind of ulcers and it was like all the tension went out of the room. And the next day our meeting was entirely different. It was pretty.
Yeah, I think for me what it was is up until that point in time, progress had been made on a number of sort of individual relationships. This was an event that actually had an impact on the group as a whole. And So I'm just curious, sort of picking up on that, can any of the rest of you think of sort of transformational moments? And if you can't, I'll help you in a second. Steve?
Well, similar to what Sephora was saying, I know that in the Okanagan Shuswap, we had one stakeholder that was actually representing tourism that was like our social gatherer. And we got so much done in those social events, whether it was, we go on houseboats to wineries, and that's where the actual, the deals were actually started in terms of the relationships that were built there. And I think the one event that I remember very particularly is we had one rancher, that really big guy, and he got a little had a little bit too much wine to drink at one of the events, and it was one of the Engos that was helping him through this, and he was having a few problems, but it was one of those things that it really cemented a lot of the relationships through the recreational activities and the social activities. And I would totally agree that those set the foundations for the eventual agreements that were reached. I also, I have an interesting observation on the Great Bear. I was involved at the back end of the Great Bear, and the interesting thing is none of you were there.
No, because I was involved right at the beginning.
Exactly. So,
This is the first time you're hearing these stories.
Yeah, and so I started thinking to myself, the length of these processes, you have to have a lot of transfer of knowledge and a lot of people involved, and to get to the end, because the people that start them aren't the people necessarily that finish them.
No, I think that's been the most shocking thing to me in all the processes I've been involved in, is actually how long they take. Yeah. And recognizing, trying to set benchmarks along the way to keep going, like some success along the way, doable things, is pretty critical. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how many announcements of the Great Bear I've been at, but at least 4. And I actually remember in 2007 when I got the phone call, cabinets passed the decision, and I remember I put the phone down and I was a little shaky, and my husband said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "We did it. We've protected the Great Bear Rainforest." And my son, who's 8 at the time, he goes, "Oh, Mommy, you've been protecting the Great Bear Rainforest my whole life." I was like, it's true, I have. But it takes a long time, and there is a huge shift that happens, and it actually should happen. I am not an implementer. I'm really terrible at it. I don't have the patience of the Dr. Jody Hillams or the many other people who sat at the implementation tables. And so there are different skills needed at different times in a collaborative process, and that's okay. And actually the individuals who hang on to it, that's a problem. Because some people who are going to be really out-of-the-box creative thinkers and great to start things off are really not the people you need in the long term.
Anybody else? Linda.
Back to the Great Bear, before your time, my dear, before your time. There was, we had reached a point in the process where, to use my market-based model, we needed some angel investors. We needed money because we had a few solutions on the table that might work and had to do with joint science and pilot projects and all, and none of that's free. And we sort of, the environmental groups, sort of, well, you're the companies, you can put the money down, and or maybe we can get government and to pay for it. But anyhow, so the thing about joint solutions is there's got to be a joint accountability for paying for them and for implementing them, and that's really what helps the process extend over time because it's got the resources, right? So we needed money, and it was a collective we, and Maren Smith, who was then with Forest Ethics, was going down to another meeting, you must think I just spend all my time in California, another meeting in California, only it was with US foundations and donors who had been funding the campaigns against the BC coastal forest companies, right? So there was a market campaign in Europe, and that was also part of the, the burning platform that created some of the incentive for the process. So anyhow, Maren was going to go down and ask for money for the joint solutions that had come out of the multi-party collaboration. And so she said to me, well, why don't you come with me because you can validate that the industry will match. And I sort of thought, ooh, wow, I don't know. Delegated mandate, wait a minute. I don't know about that, but how much money are we talking? So anyhow, so Marin went down to California. I went with her. She gave the presentation, put the value proposition on the table to the environmental investors, if you like, a kind of syndicate of environmental investors. And they said that they would be willing to put $2 million into the joint solution, provided that industry would match it, and then we would both go to government and see if government would also come in, because we could make the argument that communities and local processes could also benefit from that funding. So they said they would do that. So we flew back to Vancouver, and I went into that group of CEOs who had really impressed, with my first value proposition argument around this, but was able to put on the table to them that, and at that point we were getting pressure about how long is this going to take, how much is it going to cost, what do you think we're made of money, wood prices have gone down, right? And so, but we were able to say, well, we have $2 million from the foundations, the US foundations, and they're willing to take $2 million out of the campaigns, the market campaigns that they're funding against our companies right now, and put it into solutions if you will match it, right? And there'll be some transparency and accountability around how that money is spent in terms of joint science and local communities and First Nations. So that was an offer that was too good to resist, and so the companies agreed to that, and suddenly we had $4 million, which, in the overall scheme of things and the multi-year nature of a process like that may not sound like very much, but at that point, to be able to get a $4 million investment in these solutions that were coming out of the multi-party collaboration was really, the moment where we all thought, hey, we're not in Kansas anymore. Something's happening here.
So Mark, I'm kind of curious. You're in active negotiations with Janet right now. My question is, what's more challenging?
No, I meant hold hands, not shake hands.
So what's more challenging, dealing with her or dealing with your caucus? Remember, Chatham House rules.
Okay, I'm going to answer this. And I'm going to answer this.
Come on, I'm a breeze.
No, I know. So in the proverbial Janet, or what Janet represents and what my, and so it varies day by day. And Janet and I have a very good relationship. So dealing with the ENGO interests, I'll answer the question that way, as opposed to dealing, and I can speak more specifically about my own industry caucus, because I can be a little bit more direct there. It really changes. As we talked about, or I mentioned earlier, there are points in time, and people on the stage here have mentioned the fact that, like, when is the right landing time, when is the right time to collaborate? You have to answer those questions in your own caucus as well, because people they get heated about a particular thing. I mean, I represent 20 companies, or work with 20 companies, and what we are doing across the landscape is going to impact one of them in a certain way more than it's going to impact another one at any point in time. And so you just have to pick your places. But I would say it is equally challenging. I mean, the assumption would be that it would be more difficult for us as a forest sector to deal with the ENGOs than it is to deal with our own internal issues in politics and people seeing boogeyman around every corner.
So just to follow up, Mark,
it's 50.
before I throw it open for others, I'm curious what your advice would be, though, because I do know it's challenging sometimes for all of you in terms of actually dealing with your own caucus, in the sense of you're on the front lines, you begin to see things perhaps sooner or in a different way. So what's your advice in terms of when you have concerns being expressed in your caucus or you're meeting resistance there? What's your top 3 tips in terms of?
One thing would be, and Linda and Sephora spoke to it just now, is rather than you trying to convince, or me trying to convince my own caucus, or perhaps Janet trying to convince her own caucus, invite external parties in, or to be that external validator, or to have somebody else speak the message, or prove the point without you having to try to convince somebody of something. So, I mean, it's the reason why we bring in consultants to various meetings that we all have within our organizations, because it's sometimes, you can sometimes convince somebody of something by somebody else saying it rather than you saying it for the 50th time. And within a collaborative process, bringing somebody in from the quote-unquote other side to share a perspective. They're not coming in to convince or to win the argument in the moment. They're coming in to share a perspective and to be able to answer questions and have a dialogue. That can break log jams internally.
So any other thoughts from the rest of the
Yeah,
panel?
I'll just give actually, I mean, Mark didn't say this, but I would say that trying to wrangle all of the NGOs into a collective position is equally as hard as trying to negotiate with industry, because when you sit down and you're sitting down in isolation, you're off in a room, you're having a conversation and you're saying, okay guys, we have to have this conversation around predator-prey management. And you get one NGO saying, nope, we can't discuss it. That's off the table. We can never have that conversation. Okay, but I'm negotiating a forest management plan in Alberta where they have predator-prey management. Can't discuss it. No, not going to happen. So we have that kind of conversation very live and in person in our NGO caucus. As Mark's saying, when you bring somebody external into the conversation, you might invite, for example, an Elston Dutz who works for Alberta Pacific, and he works on caribou, and he knows a lot about caribou and certainly knows a lot about policies in Alberta. And Elston is such a guy of good integrity. He will sit down and give you almost without any emotion all the practical whys and wherefores of how things work in Alberta and what's going on. When he does that in terms of the contexts of the NGO caucus, and then leaves the meeting, and then you're left with people looking at the stark reality and going, oh, okay, I see why you're saying we have to have a conversation about this. And it is that it comes home to roost. It's very, very easy to take principled positions in isolation when you actually don't have to look at facts, when you don't have to confront them, when you aren't faced with them. And in a multi-party stakeholder kind of process, it's often that you're negotiating in one area, especially with the CBFA, where we've got almost every province in Canada where we're negotiating forest management plans. So it's very easy for somebody to take a principled position that isn't in that region and say, well, we can't possibly do that. And so you have to use other folks to come into the conversation and start to take apart what are assumptions, what they think are facts, and introduce some of the home truths, the realities.
And we as individuals have to, I mean, Smora mentioned the fact that we're human. We naturally, we assume that it's expected of us in the positions that we hold within our companies or organizations, government, industry, or NGO. It's our job. We're getting paid to fix this for the constituents that we represent or that we're working with, and so we tend to sometimes hold on too long. I mean, she spoke about it in a broader context, but even in a micro context, you don't have to do it all yourself, and so rely on other people or other things to help break stereotypes or log jams for you.
Steve?
Yeah, just one observation that I've had in kind of dealing with my constituent base is it's often effective to share the problem instead of trying to convince them of the solution, and particularly help them to reach the same conclusion that your solution is actually based on. And often that is one way to build support within your kind of constituency around what's the right path to move forward versus coming back from a negotiation saying this is the only way. Share the problem, go through kind of some of the discussions you've had at the table, and then help them to reach the same conclusions you reach.
Linda or Zep, any thoughts on this, or you never have problems with your caucuses?
In diversity, there is strength.
Back to the ecosystem.
Back to the market.
There have been times in various processes where I've taken my own caucus for granted. somehow that assuming they were coming along with me because I was still holding my bottom line, and that has always been a huge mistake. I'm looking at Janet. We know this very well the last couple of years in the Boreal. But I would also say that one kind of related lesson that I've learned is that while there is a time and a place for kind of defined collaborative time-bound processes, that you're setting out a process for, and sometimes it's not the right time, people aren't ready to have the conversation or whatever, I would offer that it's always the right time for one-on-one, off-the-record conversations and learnings across sides. And because you always learn from it, and it always starts to increase your understanding and changes the culture. I mean, I've been approached by a lot of folks since I returned to Canada, and I'm working on energy issues, saying, I don't know, we don't have a solution, but do you want to talk? And my response is generally yes, because I learn something every time I talk. And I've been really making an effort to try and also just introduce other people within my community so that they can start having conversations. And because there is no replacement for a face-to-face conversation where you have your own aha moment about what that person from industry or government is facing, and your own learning because you've seen that person as a person and not just their position. And so I think trying to increase that interaction between our communities is really important. And I also just want to say, in terms of actual formal tables where you're trying to come to ideas or agreements, this whole idea that you need representation from each company or each sector or each whatever is a huge mistake, especially at the beginning. Because you can get a lot more done with a couple of people that have a lot of good relationships and social license within their communities than you can if you put 10 people who represent each of the companies or each of the environmental groups or each of the whatever at the table. And so I think we need to think really clearly about at what stage you have to have representation of all the players, and at what stage you want to actually have collaborative, trust-building relationship and thinking outside the box. Because thinking outside the box with 20 people who are all there representing a certain organization is almost impossible.
I think what Sephora says is true. That said, one of the things that is very challenging sometimes is that there are constructs to deal with things. I mean, there's a land use planning process, there's a steering committee, or there's an executive committee, and the box says that they are the group that's going to fix it. So you need acts of leadership and stepping outside the box in order to just say, well, no, I'm just going to have a conversation about this. Because selling the fact that you were going to have 3 people represent have a conversation representing the whole as opposed to getting everybody there is often as difficult. It's often impossible because somebody feels left out. So you just have to do it, and so don't allow yourself or a process to be hamstrung by constructs. And so it comes down to just having initiative and taking personal initiative or acts of leadership and doing it, or looking for people that will.
I want to say one more thing about bringing your caucus or your community along. In this era of social networking and blogs, it's entirely different than when we started it, doing this work that a lot of the case studies that we're talking about here today. Because now there are so many voices talking all the time. So for example, in the Facebook example that I used earlier on, we actually created a forum that was for us to talk to Facebook employees and for them to talk to each other about these issues, and a whole Twitter stream that was just for that, and and that was actually super important because the culture of the company was that they were our people. They were progressives, so of course they were on the right side of this issue, and they actually became the champions from the inside because we bothered to actually talk to them directly, etc. And I've been actually wondering, now that we're starting to do this, maybe it's not because you're at a table, maybe you can't be writing something that you've learned, but somebody else could be writing a blog about, that other environmental groups would read that would share that kind of learning. It's just, there's a level of information now out there that is really different, that we can use to our advantage to share learnings as we go.
Okay, so we're going to move to questions from the audience quickly, but before we do, just any last, one pearl of wisdom from each of you. If folks here could have one takeaway from today, what would it be? Notice how they all look away from me, hoping that I won't ask them first.
It's just to keep our eyes on the lights.
Yeah. Steve?
I think that, you know, my experience, I think you make sure you have the influencers at the table, understand, you know, who you're kind of dealing with, understand how their, you know, their caucus and their constituents interact with those influencers. It'll make your life a lot easier as you kind of move forward. You won't get down, you know, kind of blind alleys that can often cause a lot of delays in processes.
Think small, depending on the nature of the situation you're in or what your opportunities and constraints are. You know, we've been talking about big processes here, but I've certainly been involved with a lot of little processes that made a big difference and, you know, changed things over time, or were really part of changing things over time for the better, depending on the issue you're working on. So there's nothing wrong with starting with a small project and a small process and seeing how it goes, and it doesn't have to cost a fortune. You know, I was talking about the $4 million we raised, you know, at one point in the Great Bear Rainforest process, but I think the first time that I ever did a joint project with an environmental group in BC, it was actually building a trail on a coastal island with a local First Nations and environmental group, and it cost $5,000, and it mainly employed the local youth and some students. But it began things that hadn't happened before, so.
One might be try to be as comfortable as possible living in a fluid environment, because these things always change. I mean, as Steve talked about, we often outlive a lot of the decisions that are taken. And so understanding how you're going to engage, know that it's going to be fluid. And I think the best leaders, people talk about CEOs, some of the best CEOs are those who can adapt to or live in fluid environments, and these things tend to be.
For me, it's being courageous and willing to reward courage. And I'll give a very small example. When I first started out as an environmentalist, I was working at Pollution Probe when we were dealing with having released the Canadian Green Consumer Guide, and we were getting 20,000 information inquiries a year, and it was a lot of people very interested in the environment. And one day I took a phone call from somebody who was speaking very softly on the phone, and I could barely hear them, and I said, I'm sorry, I can't hear you, can you speak up? Well, I'm calling from Canon printers, and we're thinking about recycling our printer cartridges, but we don't want to tell anybody. I said, what? Why don't you want to tell anybody? Well, because you see, if we tell anybody, then they'll be mad at us because our printer ink is still toxic. And I said, are you crazy? This is like a great idea. And the idea was they were going to actually make the printers, you could refill them. So they could recycle them and reuse them. And for every industry, they were going to give you a little courier package so you could mail it back to them and get it refilled, right? And many of you have used those kinds of printer cartridges over the years. And that little phone call was, we'd like to do this, but if the media hear about it, everybody will hear that our printer ink is still toxic. And I jumped on that and I said, no, I tell you what, we will actually support you in your announcement. We'll get other people to say this is a good idea. The first question I need you to answer, though, is why are you doing this? Well, you see, because our kids do litterless lunch, and the kids were complaining that we do this printer ink stuff, and we were trying to figure out what we could do that would be good for the environment. And Canon was so worried about what the response was going to be, and that one person making that courageous phone call and reaching out and just saying, I don't know if this is a good idea. And sometimes it takes that one person to reach across the table and say, this might be crazy, but what about if we did X? And that sometimes can transform the entire conversation. And you have to be ready to stand in your moment and say, you know what, I know your printer ink's still toxic, but the fact that you're going to transform your industry by mailing these things out and having them mailed back and refilling them, that's light years ahead of where your competitors are, and I'm willing to say it.
I would say I love the way you framed, Linda, this, you don't know all the answers going into it. And in fact, if you had all the answers, you wouldn't kind of going into it, or at least that's what I heard. You saying you never know what's going to come out of a good process. I think that's really true, and I think it applies to kind of my big lesson in all of this, which is just don't assume. Don't, Mark, you said this, don't assume you know what someone else is thinking, especially someone who you consider kind of on the other side. Don't assume that there's no room for discussion. I'm doing a lot of work right now on oil sands, and some of you may know I'm a fairly vocal critic of some of the current operations. And I had a conversation with an oil sands executive recently that just kind of floored me again. He said to me, honestly, I'm really losing sleep because of climate change since the last IPCC report came out, and I read it back to back, and I've just finished reading the US study, and I'm trying to figure out what do we do? And it was just the fact that, I just assumed. I assumed, A, he didn't believe in climate change. I assumed he would never have read the IPCC report. And then we got all wonky, and I was like, really? And did you read chapter, and then he was like, we were in the same conversation. And as we started talking about the issues, we ended up talking about big issues here around pace and scale. And he said to me, wait a minute, are you saying you're not saying shut it down right now? And I said, I'm not an idiot. You can't just shut it down. And so at that moment I realized I had this huge assumption about him. He had this huge assumption about me, and what I was saying. And so we weren't even having a conversation before that. And so I just think, just don't assume, because you never know what you're going to find there.
Okay, so this is where my part of the day is over, in the sense it's now up to you folks to ask questions. Hi, Norm. So what I'd like to encourage is, at this point in time, if you have any questions either for the panel as a whole or for anyone in particular, please feel free to ask. I'd far rather have you go out the room you asked a question that they've declined to answer, as opposed to telling me, I really wish I'd asked this question, but I was concerned about it. So you had a question? Okay.
So I've been enjoying watching Daniel ask you all these questions, almost as though he's sort of outside of the process, the puppet master,
Well done.
But, it occurs to me that all you folks are very able negotiators, advocates, to the extent that you're pretty comfortable picking up the phone and talking to some of your purported adversaries. And I'm wondering if you still see utility in third-party assistance.
Not really.
And if you do, when is that still needed, and how is it needed? Or are you just so past that now?
Is that for us?
I have a very strong opinion on this matter, which is yes, and pretty much always. Because in my experience, there is a translation role, and if you can find someone, like Dan and many others that I've worked with in Canada, who, not many, but some, who have trust on all sides, who you really trust, and then they learn faster than you. Like Dan knows more about industry and spends more time with industry than I do, for sure. I probably, but that's why it's very useful, because sometimes he can say to me, what did you hear in that meeting? And I'll be like, I heard blah, blah. And he's like, really? Because that's not what they said. And we have these conversations. And so that translation role is critical. But also, so is the keeping track of what's gone on. And the timelines, and then, but actually, at the last meeting, you agreed to this. Oh, I did, and because people rewrite history, and sometimes they rewrite history not because they're bad people, but because they got pushback from their caucus, and they're just, I didn't really agree to that, actually. I said I would, and Dan will be like, no, you agreed to that. And so it's a tracking of the process as well as that translation, in my opinion, is really, really useful pretty much all the time.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think, fundamentally people do need help to find the solutions. And as much as, we've all got a lot of experience in negotiation, we still bring our own perspectives, our own thoughts, our own biases into the system. And to have somebody that can actually kind of see those and help both parties kind of understand kind of a path forward is really critical. And it's for me, it's simply a value proposition. I wouldn't do it unless it actually made sense and created value. And my experience is it always has. So, strong proponent.
Go ahead, Linda.
Yeah, I would just, the term I like to use for it is a safe place to go. And that could be an individual, a facilitator. It could be an institution. It could be a process that's designed to do that. But if you're really trying to, especially if it's a very polarized situation, then it's very risky for people to enter into some of these types of discussions. And so you have to have a safe place to go. And without that, I don't think you make progress. You don't really bring really divergent points of view into the same room.
I think that one of the things that tends to happen in conversations within an industry caucus, or maybe Janet could speak to currently what we're talking about within the E&Jo caucus, is that the group, you have subgroups and working groups, and they can often think, no, I don't need it. So selling that internally, like I'm on the same page pretty much always. But it's not to come in to facilitate a meeting, and that's where people, because they try to reduce costs. It's expensive, and we don't need. And it's either it's both expensive, and we don't need it. We can get it done. And there are times when you probably don't. But it's a process. It's not just a meeting, and so it's what happens in between meetings and around the edges that's important. And people often think about facilitation as only when you get to a tough point, but you need it long before, because you never know when you're going to need it.
Yeah, I would agree that you need it most of the time. And what I mean by that is that I've been lucky enough to be involved in 2 CBFA planning processes where we've had facilitation, and as Mark is saying, you need it at those times when you don't think you need it. And then 2 of the processes that I've been involved in where we got down to the planning, where things became such that industry was completing my sentences, and I was completing their sentences, and we were actually sitting looking at a plan. One of them was in Alberta and one was in Ontario, where I felt that the facilitator, even though he was there, was almost removed because the conversation now was so intuitively understood between both of us around a common set of issues, and we really both were taking on the other person's reality and experience and wanted to know how to solve it, that we'd gone past the point of needing that big facilitation. We were now at the point of where, no, I'm going to help you solve your problem. And when we got to that point, then we were going faster. And that was a great space to be in. But up until then, you absolutely need to have the facilitation.
You have to recognize the point at which it becomes a hindrance, as Janet says, and also avoid it becoming a crutch as well, because it can be one of those things where it slows the process because one or the other party uses it as a crutch. But I think that's the exception. I mean, that's in a minority of cases.
That's when you get to the final finishing line. And it also is, it's based on relationships as well. Like if Mark picks up the phone and says, I want to have a chat, we don't have a facilitator there. We sit down and say, okay, so what is your problem, or why is this an issue, or what's going on? And then it's an honest conversation.
She says that a lot. What's your problem?
But we've built that over a lot of conversations, right? It doesn't happen like that. It happens over a lot of conversations and experience.
So, other questions from the rest of you? One over here.
So the program talks about, how effective you guys have been involved with various collaborations. I would suspect at some point in time that there's been an ineffective collaboration. Now, I'm not asking for war stories for the sake of war stories, but where the roadblocks have been insurmountable, what was the lesson, or what was a lesson that you took from one of those areas where the roadblocks were insurmountable, and how did you change to be able to improve your effectiveness?
Who wants to tackle that first?
I would like to tackle it, but we haven't figured it out yet. So I'll have to think.
Well, I would say that so far in the Boreal process, there have been a number of times where we could have achieved more, I think, than we have in the implementation. And I'm sure, as people know, there have been some big blow-ups. And I think part of that, in hindsight, looking back to those days stuck in that weird hotel outside of Toronto where we were trying to negotiate the MOU and stuff. Was it Novotel? I think we should have spent more time really pulling apart what the implementation looked like and creating regional conversations prior to the big kind of announcement of the beginning, et cetera, and trying to figure out what the implementation looked like at a regional level. So we were kind of really focused on getting to the starting gate, you know, that initial agreement, and that put an enormous amount of pressure on the process. And the implementation stuff wasn't as clear as it could have been, that's my opinion. But then moving forward, I think part of the problem came from changing players and a lack of trust. It often came down to either within our own caucus, which really happened, but also between. And the point is, the processes do take a long time. And so what happened in that process is a number of us left. I went to work on climate change, and a bunch of people left, and then there wasn't that same grouping at the table, and the trust wasn't rebuilt up with different leaders. And in fact, there wasn't consistency on the players' part of the leaders who were at the table. So if people keep changing, and it becomes we're just negotiating these issues, and you stop being creative together and stop having trust and stop having relationships, and then it just starts to break down. And so I would say that there's been a number of bumps in the road on that process where we probably could have achieved a lot more than we have today.
Steve?
Yeah, one example I kind of look to, and this was a mining company, First Nations issue, and as government, we let the proponent kind of engage for far too long without the skill sets that were required to build the respectful relationships and actually work within kind of the social license. And instead of engaging earlier, didn't engage until the relationship was so bad it never could get fixed. And that basically impacted the project all the way through. So I think the learning there is, for us is, know when to engage, know when to see that there's some, irreconcilable personalities that are not going to get there, and do it early before you get to a situation where the personalities actually take over the project and you never reach success because of that.
Anything else before we throw it back to the floor, Linda?
I can think of when I worked on the Olympic Games in Vancouver, on some of the social issues, dealing with some of the social activists around those issues. It just wasn't possible to get a collaboration that was really diversified in terms of the different stakeholders. It was just easier to get, the city of Vancouver and the corporate sponsors for the games and maybe the provincial government and some community organizations on board, because some of the social activist groups, there was no upside for them to getting involved in a collaborative process, right? And so as a dynamic, if you think you can gain more by staying outside of the collaboration, if you think you can get more from a unilateral approach, then you're just never going to go into a multilateral approach. You might sometimes go into a bilateral one. But so you've got to really think that through the beginning of your process about what are the incentives, why people are actually going to be in this process and want to stay in it, right?
Any other questions? Uh-oh.
Tell us a little more about the relationship with First Nations and these processes. You've all been at it for a while, so what have you learned along the way? What are the successes? What are the lessons learned?
Kate?
So I guess my first experience in dealing with Aboriginal issues around forestry was in Clayoquot Sound, and the Vassalormet Zipporah, the company I work for, arrested her and about 900 other people in the largest display of civil disobedience in Canadian history, peaceful civil disobedience. anyhow, so it was quite fractured after that had happened, right? The year after that had happened. And it really was the chiefs in Clayoquot Sound that, government had put together processes, but, the processes, the land use planning processes hadn't been able to get to a result. And it really was the chiefs in Clayoquot Sound who came forward with kind of holding at least the companies and the environmental groups, both of our feet to the fire to sort of say this couldn't go on again for another summer, right? The next summer had to be different. They weren't going to tolerate that in their traditional territories, and if that's what we thought could happen again, then none of us were ever going to be in Clayoquot Sound again. So I think, and I think that story has played out in a lot of the resource sector context in British Columbia, which in Clayoquot ultimately led to a joint venture ecoforestry company where the local First Nations had a majority share in the company, and forest certification and different types of practices. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes the company's made money, and sometimes it hasn't. But anyhow, so a big role, yeah, in these kinds of processes.
I think what we have to realize is, there's in this interplay, there's 4 levels of government. There's the provincial government, there's the municipal governments, there's the federal government, and there's a First Nations government. And First Nations want government-to-government dialogue with provincial government around these types of issues. And I think a lot of mistakes were made earlier on in trying to treat First Nations as stakeholders in collaborative processes. They're not stakeholders. They are a form of government, and that's the way the relationship needs to form. The other thing is that we're learning, and this is something that just recently we announced British Columbia an environmental stewardship initiative around LNG pipelines, and what we didn't do is bring a solution to the table to First Nations. We actually just put the idea out and have now got a collaborative in developing the whole program. And I think it's about the relationship, and it's about the respect, and it's about early entry, and not bringing kind of what you may feel is the solution to the table, but working together early in the project. That's a real critical key, and understanding that you're dealing with a government, and it's a government-to-government relationship from the provincial government's perspective.
Okay. Anything else before we go on? One more question after this.
Just going to
Janet,
say, in terms of, because I've worked in various regions across Canada, in terms of the First Nations working relationship, it has really been about asking the First Nations how they would like to be in relation to the conversation. So in some regions of the country, like in Manitoba, they've said we want to be at the table. In some regions of the country, in Ontario, they've said to us, we don't want to actually be at your table because that's a stakeholder table. We want you to bring us whatever you're thinking, then we'll tell you what we think of it. So we work best when we take the direction of the First Nation as a government, and they tell us how they would like to interact.
Well, I would just also add that even when you feel like you have common ground and shared perspectives, and my experience with First Nations communities and leadership, don't make the mistake of assuming therefore your issues are the same or you understand them, because they're not, right? There's a whole history there, and how those leaders prioritize their issues and et cetera is not going to be the same. And that's really important to try and understand, because sometimes you don't talk about the prioritization of issues. And that has hit me back in the face a number of times, where the government comes in and, for example, in Clayoquot offers an intermeasures agreement, or Macmillan Waddell says, okay, we won't log this sacred place, but in fact we will. Kirk will log these other places, and everything changes overnight. And I didn't, there was actually a moment right after, when Linda said the summer after, where the First Nations in Clayoquot Sound declared war on Greenpeace. And I was responsible for Greenpeace at the time. And just imagine, the headline where it says First Nations declare war on Greenpeace. And you have to stand in front of your board and explain how you've potentially destroyed Greenpeace, which was not the best moment of my career. But we worked it out, right? And we sat down and we talked it through, and we figured out, actually we did have a lot of shared ground, and and they were tired of being in the middle of our conflict. and they were going to do anything they could to make sure that that didn't happen anymore and that their issues came to the front. And so we worked it out, but it was ugly for a while there.
So I think we have time for one more question over here.
So the comment was made earlier about this is about relationships, and Zipporah, you mentioned that changing players at the table can create trust issues and obstacles. But to whoever in the panel wants to address it, have you ever been, or do you often get in situations where you have to change players at the table? Because as Steve mentioned, personalities take over the discussion rather than the issues. Do you ever find you're in that situation where changing the players can be more productive than dragging out the ongoing issues?
Yes. I won't name any names because that would be mean, but there, no question. For reasons on both sides, because sometimes people just get entrenched and they get, they're more interested in what they have to say than and how they're articulating their power, et cetera, than what other people have to say, and they're just not having a conversation. And so you need to figure that out. But also on the other side, like I've actually experienced it where, relationships were built so strongly. Like, let's be clear, it gets harder to say no and figure out where your lines in the sand are as you're getting to know people and you're understanding their barriers. And, understanding that if I say, no, we won't agree to you logging in that valley, that I know that's going to mean 100 jobs are lost and it's your head on the line. And so it gets, the more complex you understand an issue, the harder it gets, right, to be in these discussions. And sometimes there are people that can no longer hold the line. And if they go past a certain line, for example, if they're representing the environmental community, they won't have the social license to make a deal because they can make all the deals they want, but the rest of the environmental community won't support it, right? Because they've gone too far. And so we've had to do that on several times.
Any other thoughts before we come to conclusion?
I think what can happen sometimes also, in somewhat the same vein perhaps, is that as those relationships get stronger, and I think industry is probably more guilty of this than the E&GO community, they're scared to piss the other side off. And because they have they're used to being, or they have historical memory of being beaten up or media or what have you, and so they just go along with it. Oh, please, hope that it works out. And so that can be as troublesome or problematic within a negotiation or a collaborative conversation as well, because like I say, I think we've been often guilty of it, because the E&GO caucus, for example, will go away thinking, oh, okay, well, it's all cool, when really there is still a lot of underlying discomfort. And so unless it's spoken, you have to have people that are willing to speak, speak up as well as be sensitive to not be abrasive.
Yeah, I'll just finish that off. So what Mark's alluding to is I've been actually in meetings where I thought everything was going well. Then I get a call from Mark saying, that stuff that we were talking about where you thought things were going well, actually a couple of the industry guys called me up and really, we can't agree to that at all. And it's not that way at all, and it's not going to work out this way. But what's important is if you have good facilitators, you have and not necessarily a good association, but somebody who's sort of looking out for the whole, like a Mark, who can sort of go, okay, it's time to maybe bring a different set of people to a table and have a conversation. So you don't necessarily replace somebody at the negotiating table, but you might take it offline and say, I'm going to get this smaller group to wrestle this issue. Or the facilitator might just say, let's go to a concert. I'm going to make these two people who can't talk to each other normally have a different conversation. And when you do that and you break it apart in different ways, then you actually start to find where you can actually surface a solution or bring it out. Or maybe it's not even a solution, but you could bring it out so that I understand that industry actually has a different set of problems than I thought they had, because they were too scared to say something, or somebody didn't want to admit something, or they didn't feel comfortable. And having a Mark be able to say, Janet, look, that's just not going to fly, is really, really good.
I don't mean to prolong this too much longer, but one of the other things is that there's a difference between the sort of the corporate and the operational, speaking from a company perspective, in that you know, having somebody sit at a, I mean, as we've all heard this in life, everything is a negotiation. So yes, there are formal tables, but then there are also just the sort of conversations that take place that are part of a collaborative process that, you know, are part of negotiation, but not sitting at a formal table. And it's often the case, at least from within a company, that somebody is put in a position to have a conversation or to fix it because it's within their job description, or it's in their tenure. They're responsible for getting that tree to that mill to that market, and because it's in their box on an org chart, they're the person that gets the job. And we have to be careful not to put people in positions that they're not well suited for. I mean, if your skill set is to be as efficient in running that operation as possible, that's the job. And we as those who are overseeing process need to make sure that the right person is in the right conversation, even if it doesn't seem like a fit on an org chart.
So I recognize, Robin, we've now been sitting for 3 hours without a break, and our time is up. So what I'd like to do is thank all of you for your patience and your questions. And Robin, turn it back to you.
Yeah, so as Dan said, I know that you haven't been able to stand for a while, but if you bear with me for just 2 more minutes, we're going to thank the speakers. I have some quick announcements, and then you're free. So if everybody would join me just with a round of applause to thank our speakers.